They said her scars made her weak, a ghost of the woman she once was. Whispers followed her through the dusty streets of the frontier town, where laughter often turned cruel, and pity was a blade sharper than steel. To them, she was nothing more than a widow carrying the ruins of a past life on her face, a reminder of fire and loss. But what they didn't know was that behind those scars burned a wolf fiercer than any storm that swept the plains. The Old West was merciless to women alone, and even more merciless to those who bore marks of survival. Every stare she endured was a battle, every mocking word a wound reopened. Yet while they measured her worth by the lines etched into her skin, she carried within her the memory of a husband lost to violence, of nights spent clutching only silence, and of promises whispered to herself beneath the endless stars. She would never bow, not to men, not to fate, not to the weight of her scars. Children were told to keep their distance, men sneered as she passed, and women whispered that her presence was a curse. But in her silence, she was preparing. She had learned to read the land, to hear the whispers of danger before others noticed, and to trust instincts that had been sharpened by suffering. They mistook her quiet for weakness, not realizing that silence in the West was often the mask of those who had seen more than most could endure. The night before everything changed, laughter rang louder than ever. They mocked her openly, their voices echoing across the saloon and spilling into the dirt streets. She stood alone, her eyes steady, refusing to let their cruelty break her. It was not the first time, and it would not be the last, but it was the final time she would ever be underestimated. For fate had already begun moving, and by dawn, the very people who mocked her would owe their lives to the widow they had scorned. And when that dawn came, it did not come with light, but with fire. Raiders descended on the village, armed and merciless, their cries slicing through the morning air. As fear spread and chaos reigned, it was not the strong men of the town who rose first, but the scarred widow. She stood where no one else dared, her scars catching the firelight, her courage cutting sharper than any blade. By the time the sun climbed the horizon, the same mouths that had mocked her were whispering a new word, Savior. The raiders stormed in with the ferocity of wolves, their rifles cracking through the silence of dawn. Dust rose from hooves pounding the ground, and the cries of fear echoed through the village. Men scrambled for their weapons, children clung to their mothers, and panic spread faster than fire on dry brush. It was chaos, the kind that made even the bravest hesitate. Yet, in the heart of that storm, the widow did not tremble. She stepped forward, her eyes sharp and unwavering, as if she had been waiting her whole life for this very moment. While the others scattered, she moved with a certainty that silenced those who noticed her. She knew the land, the ridges where raiders would hide, the weak points in the fences that guarded their herds, the old rifles stored in the church that no one remembered. Her scars had not only been marks of survival, but maps of wisdom. Every wound carried memory, and those memories were now weapons sharper than bullets. When the raiders set fire to the stables, it was she who shouted the command to divert the cattle, turning the stampede against the invaders. When they advanced into the square, she revealed hidden traps laid days earlier, pits covered with branches that sent horses crashing down. What looked like instinct was, in truth, the result of sleepless nights, of preparation no one else had considered necessary. The widow had been watching, waiting, and ready. The villagers, stunned, began to follow her lead. Men who once mocked her scars now found themselves listening to her voice, obeying her calls, and discovering courage in her defiance. For the first time, the town fought not as scattered souls, but as one, bound together by the presence of a woman they had long dismissed. Her strength was not born in that moment. It had been carved into her by years of loss, by every sneer and laugh she had endured. And now, it shone like fire against the dawn. The raiders faltered. What had seemed like an easy conquest was turning into a battle they had not expected. And at the center of it all stood the widow, her scars glistening with sweat and dust, her voice steady, her will unbreakable. The same woman who had been mocked in whispers only yesterday was now the anchor that kept an entire village from falling. As the battle stretched into the morning, the widow's presence only grew stronger. She moved through the smoke and dust like a spirit of the land itself, guiding the young to safety, urging the wounded to hold on, and leading the charge where the danger was greatest. The raiders began to curse her name, firing at her with desperation, for they saw clearly that she was the heart of the resistance. If she fell, the village might collapse, but if she stood, they would never claim victory. The people who had once laughed at her now shielded her with their own bodies, following her without question. For the first time, they realized that scars were not signs of weakness, but proof of survival, proof of battles endured that no one else could have borne. Each line on her face was a reminder that she had stood against storms before, storms that had already tried to break her, and failed. By midday, the raiders retreated into the hills, bloodied and beaten, their pride shattered by a village led by a widow they had underestimated. Smoke rose from the fields, the scent of ash and gunpowder filling the air, but the people still stood. And in the center of their survival, with dust clinging to her hair and her clothes torn by battle, stood the widow. Her scars, once mocked, were now badges of honor. The children gathered around her first, their small hands clutching at her dress, eyes wide with the kind of awe that no words could capture. Then the elders came, voices trembling as they offered her the respect they had once denied. Even the strongest men of the town bowed their heads, unable to hide the shame of their laughter, nor the gratitude that now burned in their chests. She had not only saved their lives, she had saved their pride. But the widow did not bask in their praise. She simply stood, breathing heavy, her eyes scanning the horizon. For she knew the truth of the West. Danger was never fully gone, and survival was never secured forever. The lesson was simple yet unshakable. Scars were not signs of weakness. They were shields, carved into the flesh by battles that prepared the soul for the next storm. And storms, in the West, always returned. In the days that followed, the widow became the name on every tongue. Around campfires, men who once mocked her now retold the story of how she had faced down raiders when even they had faltered. Children whispered her name as if it were a charm against fear, and women looked at her scars with new eyes, seeing not ugliness but strength. Yet for the widow herself, nothing had changed. She still carried the same scars, still felt the same weight of loss, still lived with the same silence of nights where loneliness pressed heavier than any wound. The villagers began to approach her with gifts, bread, wool, even weapons, as tokens of gratitude. But she accepted nothing, for she knew that gratitude given in peace was fragile, and that the same voices that praised her now could just as quickly turn to blame if another storm fell. The Old West had a way of making people forget, and she understood better than anyone that respect earned through blood was always at risk of being lost. One evening, a council of elders gathered, inviting her to sit among them. It was the first time they had ever offered her such a seat, a recognition of her role as the savior of the town. The widow listened as they spoke of rebuilding fences, strengthening alliances, and preparing for the next threat. But when they asked her to share her wisdom, she said only one thing: do not wait for another storm to remember who stand beside you. Her words fell heavy, leaving the room in silence, for they knew she was right. As the nights grew quieter and the town rebuilt, she often walked alone to the edge of the plains, staring out at the horizon where the raiders had vanished. She knew they would return, or others like them would. In the West, peace was never permanent. But instead of fear, she carried resolve. The scars on her face and body were no longer just reminders of the past. They were promises of what she could endure and of how much further she was willing to go. Still, in the quiet of those nights, she felt the ache of loneliness deeper than ever. Saving the town had not healed her heart, nor had it erased the cruelty she had suffered before the raid. She had become a legend, yes, but legends in the West often carried solitude like a second skin. The people admired her, but few truly knew her. And in that truth lay the quiet sorrow that even victory could not silence. Rumors of her courage spread beyond the village, carried by traders and travelers who passed through dusty trails. Soon, her name reached distant towns, where people spoke of the scarred widow who had stood against raiders and turned the tide. To some, she became a figure of inspiration, proof that even those dismissed by society could rise above it. To others, her Her story was a curiosity, a tale retold with exaggeration in saloons where men laughed nervously, as though mocking her could ease the discomfort her strength created. But power, even the power of respect, is never without enemies. Some men in her own town began to feel the sting of pride wounded too deeply. They had been the ones mocked now, their failures laid bare by her defiance. Though they had praised her in the heat of gratitude, bitterness soon crept into their voices. They whispered that perhaps she had invited danger by her very presence, that her scars were not just marks of survival, but omens that drew misfortune. The West was harsh, and jealousy was as deadly as bullets. The widow, however, did not waste her breath on defending herself. She had already learned that the judgment of others was as fleeting as smoke. Instead, she poured her strength into training the young, teaching them how to hold a rifle, how to track the land, how to listen for signs of danger in the wind. For her, survival was not a story to be told. It was a skill to be passed on. And in doing so, she began to give the town something greater than salvation: preparation. The children who once avoided her now followed her steps eagerly, their small voices echoing her lessons as they practiced with sticks in place of rifles. Mothers, who had once pulled their children away, now encouraged them, watching with cautious pride as their little ones learned under her stern but protective gaze. Slowly, the widow was no longer seen only as the woman with scars, but as the teacher who shaped the future of the town. Still, the shadows of doubt never fully faded. At every gathering, she could feel the eyes of men who resented her, their pride bruised beyond repair. She knew it would not be raiders alone she would have to fight, but the very people she had saved. And in the West, betrayal often came from within long before it rode in from the horizon. The first signs of betrayal came quietly, like whispers on the wind. Supplies went missing from the stores, tools disappeared from the blacksmith's shed, and fences she had helped repair were suddenly found broken in the night. Some claimed it was carelessness, others said it was chance, but the widow recognized the pattern. These were not accidents. They were warnings, deliberate acts meant to remind her that power in the West was never freely given, and that some men would rather destroy their own than admit they had been saved by her. One evening, as she returned from training the village youth, she found a message carved into her door: "Leave before the land forgets what you did." The letters were jagged, hurried, yet filled with rage. She did not flinch. She had carried scars carved deeper than words, and she knew that threats were often the weapons of those too cowardly to strike openly. Still, she tightened her guard, aware that the real storm was no longer out on the horizon, but here, festering among the very people she had bled to protect. The elders urged her to ignore it, to focus on the good she had done, but she understood the nature of resentment. Gratitude fades, envy endures. She carried herself with quiet strength, never answering with anger, but she watched, always watched. Every shadow, every glance, every hushed voice in the corners of the saloon became part of her awareness. Survival in the West was not only about rifles and horses. It was about knowing who would ride beside you and who would stab you when the night grew dark. Meanwhile, the children she trained grew braver. They spoke proudly of her lessons, of how she had taught them to listen for danger in the silence, how to stand steady even when fear clawed at their hearts. Their admiration became a shield, their voices a defense that silenced some of the whispers against her. For the first time in years, the widow felt the faintest spark of hope, that perhaps her scars would leave behind not just a story of survival, but a generation stronger than the one before. Yet hope in the West was fragile. She knew the more the children admired her, the more certain men despised her. Every lesson she passed on, every child who carried her strength in their hearts, was another reminder that her presence was reshaping the town. And in the Old West, change was rarely welcomed with open arms. The breaking point came when a small band of raiders returned under the cover of night, testing the village once more. The people rushed to defend their homes, but hesitation gripped them. Old wounds and fresh fears tangled together, leaving the town on the edge of collapse. It was the widow who once again stepped forward, her voice steady above the chaos. She rallied the youth she had trained, and though they were young, their courage held because her lessons lived in them. Side by side, children and elders followed her into the fight. Torches lit the night sky as arrows flew, and rifles cracked like thunder. The raiders, confident from afar, faltered as they faced a town no longer stumbling in fear, but moving with a strange unity born from her scars. Even the doubters who had resented her found themselves forced to follow her lead, for survival left no room for pride when death knocked at the door. When the last raider fled into the darkness, the village stood battered but unbroken. Breathless, the people looked around and realized that the defense had been led not by the men they once called strong, but by the widow and the children she had shaped. Her scars had become more than marks of her past. They were now the very shield that protected the village's future. For a brief moment, silence hung heavy, then the crowd erupted with gratitude. They carried her name with reverence, calling her savior once more. Yet beneath the praise, she saw the same eyes filled with envy, the same men grinding their teeth at the sight of her triumph. Respect and resentment lived side by side, and she knew one would not outlast the other for long. The widow lifted her gaze to the stars as the firelight flickered against her scars. She had saved them again, but deep in her heart, she carried the knowledge that her greatest battle was not against raiders or outsiders. It was against the chains of pride and bitterness within the very people she had sworn to protect. And that, she knew, was a war with no end. In the weeks after the raid, the village seemed calmer on the surface, but tension ran beneath like a river swollen with unseen currents. The widow walked through the streets and felt eyes on her back, some filled with gratitude, others with envy that cut sharper than knives. Men nodded stiffly in acknowledgement, their pride still wounded by the fact that it was she, not they, who had once again saved their lives. Children, however, ran to her freely, clinging to her hands and asking for more lessons. Their laughter reminded her of a life she had lost, but also gave her purpose. The council of elders debated in long meetings, their voices rising and falling behind closed doors. Some argued that the widow should be given authority, a place of leadership, for no one could deny her ability to guide the town. Others resisted fiercely, warning that to place a woman, and a scarred widow at that, in such a role would break tradition and stir unrest. The West was not kind to those who challenged its customs, and power was rarely surrendered without blood. Whispers began to grow louder in the saloon. Men who once followed her in battle now muttered that she had bewitched the children, that her scars carried not wisdom but curses. They said no woman should wield such influence, especially one whose face carried the mark of fire and loss. These were not words of reason, but of fear, the fear that comes when old structures begin to crumble. And fear in the West was always dangerous. The widow, sensing the shift, did not confront them directly. Instead, she continued her work quietly, training the young and guiding the women, teaching them skills long denied to them by custom. She knew that survival on the frontier belonged not only to the strong, but to those who prepared when others mocked. Her silence, steady and unbroken, became its own kind of defiance. It reminded her enemies that their laughter could not shake her, just as bullets and fire had not. But silence was not enough to stop what was coming. One night, a torch was thrown at her small home, flames licking at the wood until neighbors rushed to douse them with water. She emerged from the smoke with her head high, her scars glowing in the firelight like embers. And though the fire was extinguished, the message was clear. Envy had turned to open hatred. The West had taught her to face storms, but now she faced the storm of her own people. The attempt to drive her away did not break her. It hardened her resolve. The next morning, she stood in the square, surrounded by those who had gathered to see if she would finally bow her head and leave. Instead, she lifted her voice, steady as the wind sweeping across the plains. She reminded them of the raiders, of the fires that had nearly consumed their homes, and of the nights when fear had almost swallowed them whole. And she reminded them of who had stood between death and their children. Her words were not prideful, but fierce with truth. The people listened, torn between shame and admiration. Some lowered their eyes, unable to meet her gaze, for they knew she spoke nothing but the truth. Others gritted their teeth, unwilling to let go of their bitterness. But the children cheered, their voices breaking through the crowd like sunlight through storm clouds. They saw no scars, no curse, no shame, only the woman who had saved them when no one else had. The elders, unsettled by the division, tried to restore order. They offered her a compromise: remain in the village, but step back from leadership, from teaching, from influence. They wanted her silence, her submission, her fading into the background so that pride could rest undisturbed. But the widow only shook her head. A voice once raised in truth cannot be buried, she said, and a fire that has saved your homes cannot be put out just to soothe your pride. That night, under a sky of endless stars, she sat by the edge of the plains, the horizon stretching wide and unforgiving. She felt the weight of choice pressing against her heart, to leave and spare herself the venom of envy, or to stay and continue a battle that would never end. Either way, the West would demand more from her, for it never allowed anyone to live untouched by sacrifice. Her scars burned softly in the moonlight, not as wounds, but as reminders of the path she had walked. She knew her story was no longer just her own. It had become the story of every soul who had ever been mocked, dismissed, or underestimated, and who rose anyway, carrying not only themselves, but an entire people through the storm. Whispers of her defiance spread quickly beyond the village, carried by traders and travelers as far as the mountain trails and river crossings. Some towns spoke her name with reverence, telling of the scarred widow who had stood against raiders and against the pride of men, shaping a new way of survival. Others twisted the tale into warnings, claiming she was a curse, a woman who brought fire wherever she walked. In the West, stories often traveled faster than truth, but either way, her legend grew. The children she trained began to show the fruits of her teaching. They walked with more confidence, their eyes sharper, their hands steady when they held tools or rifles. Even the women, once silent in fear, began to gather with her, learning skills long withheld: how to track prints in the dirt, how to mend weapons, how to hear danger in the stillness of the night. Her influence was no longer limited to survival. It was reshaping the very bones of the community, and that, more than anything, terrified those who clung to the old ways. One evening, as the sun bled red across the horizon, a group of men confronted her openly in the square. They accused her of undermining tradition, of raising children to defy their fathers, of sowing seeds that would ruin the balance of the town. Their voices rose like thunder, but the widow stood calm, her gaze unwavering. She did not raise her voice. She spoke with steady conviction. If your balance depends on silence, then it was never balance at all. Her words cut deeper than any blade, leaving the men without reply. Still, the danger grew. Pride, once wounded, does not heal easily. The men who resented her began to plot more openly, gathering allies, fueling fears. Some even whispered to neighboring towns, hoping to discredit her before her influence spread further. The widow knew these were not idle threats. In the West, words often led to bullets, and envy was as deadly as any raider's rifle. But she did not retreat. Each morning she rose, scars glowing in the dawn, and continued her work. For her, survival was not just about enduring another raid. It was about building a people strong enough to face storms without breaking. And she understood a truth that others still feared to admit. Scars were not curses. They were blueprints for resilience, etched by fire to guide those who came after. The final test came with the return of the raiders, stronger than before, furious at their past defeat. They swept down on the village at night, their numbers greater, their fury unmatched. Fear once again surged through the people, but this time they were not the same as before. The widow's lessons had sunk deep. The children were quick to warn of movements in the dark. The women secured the stores and tended to the injured, and the men, even those who once mocked her, found themselves following her orders without hesitation. The battle was fierce, fire and steel clashing under the moon. Yet the village fought with a unity that stunned their attackers. Every trap, every strategy, every act of courage bore the mark of the widow's preparation. At the heart of it all, she moved like a spirit forged of dust and flame, her scars lit by firelight as though they were the very symbols of defiance itself. When the dawn broke, the raiders lay scattered, retreating once more, humiliated by a town they could not conquer. The village stood bruised but unbroken, their victory undeniable. And at the center of it, the widow stood tall, her chest heaving, her face streaked with sweat and dust, but her eyes burning with the fire of triumph. The same scars that had once brought her ridicule now marked her as the reason they still drew breath. The people gathered around her, voices trembling with gratitude. Even those who had plotted against her could no longer deny the truth. Their pride had been shattered, their envy silenced, for it was clear to all that without her, the village would have fallen. In that moment, respect was no longer forced. It was earned beyond question. She was not simply the scarred widow anymore. She had become the unshakable heart of their survival. And yet, as the cheers rose, the widow's gaze drifted to the horizon. She knew the West would never stop testing them, never stop demanding sacrifice. But she also knew this. Scars, whether on the flesh or the soul, were not marks of shame. They were proof of battles endured, proof of strength carried forward. And as long as she stood, no storm, no raider, no whisper of envy would ever erase what she had become. In the end, the widow's scars no longer spoke of tragedy, but of triumph. They were not reminders of what she had lost, but of what she had endured and overcome. The same marks that once made her the target of laughter became the very symbols of strength that bound a village together. In her silence, she had carried pain. In her courage, she had carried an entire people through storms that would have broken them without her. Her story became more than the tale of a single battle or a single woman. It became a lesson written into the dust of the frontier, that true strength is not polished or perfect, but carved by fire and loss. In the Old West, survival demanded sacrifice, but it also revealed the unshakable truth that even those cast aside could rise higher than the proudest voices. The widow proved that scars are not curses. They're the proof of battles won and lives saved. For the people of the town, her presence became a constant reminder that they owed their survival not to those who mocked the loudest, but to the one who stood firm when fear consumed them all. Children grew up pointing to her as their guide, and even the elders, once blinded by pride, came to admit that without her, their history would have ended in ashes. Her life was no longer her own. It had become a legacy, a mirror held up to every soul who doubted their worth. And so, her story calls us to reflection. How many times have we judged strength by appearances, or dismissed the value of those marked by hardship? The widow's scars tell us that greatness is not born in ease, but in fire. They challenge us to see beyond the surface, to recognize resilience where others see weakness, and to remember that the ones we underestimate may one day be the ones who save us all. If this story touched you, let its echo continue beyond this moment. Share your thoughts in the comments, for your voice adds to the legacy of resilience carried in these tales. Subscribe to the channel so that more stories of courage and sacrifice may reach you, keeping the fire of the Old West alive. And if her strength moved you, leave a like, because in keeping her story alive, you too help remind the world that scars are not the end, but the beginning of strength.